20 years ago, before this industrialization. And the situation of the poor now is exactly the same. They have not benefited from this increase in wealth. Slumdog Millionaire. If you've seen Slumdog Millionaire, it's not a film. Anyone who's been to these countries, you know, people who haven't been to these countries, English people for example, they look at Slumdog Millionaire and they think it's a film. They think, oh look, there's a real dramatization of poverty in India. But this is reality. This is reality. This is how really people are living in India. In a slum where there's no sewage, there's no water, there's no decent place to live. I visited one of these places. I spent one day in one of these places in a tin hut. The house was made of tin. And imagine the heat. The heat was incredible because tin it makes the heat, even amplifies the heat inside. Unbearable. And this is people die from this heat. They die from the fact they don't have fans in such a hot country, and the houses are designed in this way. So this is the problem of capitalist nations, that the wealth does not go down to the poor people. Even if you look to the USA, even if you look to the UK, the USA, the superpower of the world, but there's slums in the USA. There's people who don't have healthcare, who can't afford healthcare. So Islam changes all of that. Islam, the emphasis is on redistributing the wealth. The emphasis is on changing the situation of the people by, for example, as I said, no stock market, no banks, no hoarding, and the state will use all of this money, all of its tools at its disposal to make sure that the rich don't always stay, the poor don't always stay in the situation of poverty, but their situation is changed. Lastly, I'd like to talk about land in Bangladesh. There's a lot of land in Bangladesh which is completely unused and is owned by, owned by people, and they don't use that land, and no one is allowed to touch that land. So that land is fertile land, which could, a person could farm in that land and benefit from the crops in that land. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, if the land is not being used after 3 years, either you use it, you cultivate it, or you give it to your brother. So this land which is not being used by anyone, even though they may have the title to this land will be confiscated and given to someone who's going to benefit from that land. So the most important rule of all of this is the first one which I mentioned. Back to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the son of Adam has no better right than to some food, clothing and shelter. That this is a right of every single human being to have a decent living. And it's a duty of the state to make sure that this happens. And this will never happen in our countries because this will never happen in our countries because that political will, that desire by the politicians to eradicate poverty, to change the situation of the poor people doesn't exist. In Islam, there's no such thing as a budget, for example. There's no such thing as a budget. There's expenses the state has. The state has to provide for poor people. The state has to provide in situations of crisis for people who can't support themselves, regardless of whether they got enough money in their budget or not. If you don't have enough money, the state has to borrow to make sure no one starves in that country. And the best example of this is at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. When he established a state in Medina, it was a very poor, newly fledged state. Very, very poor. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did everything in his power, in his capability, as a leader of state to make sure that the poor people who were the muhajir, because the muhajir, they migrated from Mecca to Medina. Imagine, you migrate. When you migrate, you leave behind everything. You leave behind your business, you leave behind your homes, you leave behind your land. Or are you? You're penniless then. You're just completely. Imagine if you had to go to another land. You leave behind everything. These people were poor, but within a generation, the Prophet ﷺ, through his measures, had changed the situation of the Muhajir, and they were no longer poor because he gave them land, he gave them money to start new businesses, he fed those who do not have any food, even though he didn't have food to give them. Sometimes the state did not have any food to give them. So what did they do? They gave them dates and water. They didn't have anywhere to house them. They didn't have anywhere to house them, but they didn't let them sleep in the desert. They put them in the mosque. So everything to make sure that the rights of the people, their right to food, clothing and shelter was fulfilled. And if you compare this to Bangladesh, the government in Bangladesh, are they doing everything in their power to eradicate poverty? No. No, they're not. They're aiding poverty. They're increasing poverty. They're making life for the poor people even more difficult. One example. The people grow local rice, and the government allows America to flood the market with American rice. Flood the market with this cheap, very cheap, fine quality American rice. What happens? No one buys the local rice, and they all buy the cheaper imported rice. People stop growing rice because it's not feasible, it's not economically viable. So through this measure, for example, by allowing America to swamp the market with this American cheap rice, they increase poverty. They destroy the local economy. IMF and UN, they allow Bangladesh to become slaves to the IMF and UN. At the present moment, Bangladesh is paying more interest to IMF and UN than is receiving any money. So they become a slave, and these institutions start to dictate how the country should be run. So we see that politics in our countries is not about looking after the affairs of the people. It's not about looking after. It's about making money. Why do these politicians run for elections? Because to be a politician is the best form of business. If you want to become really rich in our countries, you become a politician, because then you siphon off every single contract, 10% goes in your pocket. So this is not politics. Politics in Islam is about looking after the affairs of the people, and and as long as this mentality exists in our countries, as long as we have these type of politicians, the problem of poverty is never going to be solved.